Today, Watan Arabi sits down with Dr. Raphael Cohen, senior political scientist at RAND. In this interview, Cohen shares his insights on the evolving US-Iran confrontation, Iran's military capabilities and proxy operations, strategies for shifting from military dominance to political deterrence, and the broader implication for GCC stability and regional security. Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So, could you tell us about the current status and prospects of the US-Iran confrontation? We're seeing that now the NATO spokesperson has refused to cooperate with the United States and the call of President Trump to intervene to unblock the Strait of Hormuz. How do you see this situation evolving?
Yeah, so I think where we sit is both sides are digging in for what could very well be a long fight. On the one hand, well, the Trump administration has signaled, at least particularly early on, that this is going to be a quick war. It's going to be over in the matter of weeks. That Iran is totally defeated. Iran clearly isn't totally defeated. It's still attacking both Israel, but also the GCC countries as well. Ironically enough, it's attacking countries that hitherto had been actually friendly towards Iran, which I think we can unpack the strategic logic or lack of logic in that. So, not just going after Saudi Arabia or the UAE, which have been traditionally hostile to Iran, but also places like Qatar, which has been brokered itself as an intermediary, and Oman likewise. And Iran has threatened to block the Straits of Hormuz, and it indeed is blocking the Straits of Hormuz for many Gulf tankers, except for a handful that it views as politically acceptable. The flip side of the equation, the Trump administration doesn't seem particularly inclined to back down. And the signs coming out of Israel is that they are planning on at least 3 more weeks of intensive bombarding of Iran to degrade particularly its defense industrial base. So all that points to is that this war is going to last for several weeks more, and potentially a lot longer than that.
So when you say much longer, and how does it play out at the end? What is victory for the US and what is victory for Iran?
Sure. So the United States and Israel entered this conflict with sort of 3 primary objectives in mind, and then one bonus one. Let me unpack what I mean by that. They wanted to first and foremost go after the Iranian nuclear program. And while the Iranian nuclear program had been degraded back in the 12-day war, there were signs of Iran trying to reconstitute it in some way, shape, or form. Second, it wanted Iran to place limits on its missile production capability, which we've seen to devastating effect across the region. Now, the missile program is not only important for conventional side, it's also would be the delivery mechanism for a nuclear weapon, which is why the United States and Israel, and frankly, many Gulf states also care a lot about curbing their missile capacity. And third, both the United States and Israel, and this also goes true for particularly countries like Saudi Arabia, but the other Gulf states as well, they want to curb Iran's use of its proxy network. We've seen Iran's proxies attack Israel and Hezbollah and Hamas, but they've also attacked other countries as well. Notably, the Houthis have been particularly problematic for Saudi Arabia and then in Iraq, you have groups like Kataib Hezbollah, which have been a source of regional instability as well. And so the United States explicitly wanted Iran to roll back its use of its proxy network. None of these general ideas should be particularly surprising if you've been following President Trump's rhetoric for, going back to before he ran for office. He's been particularly sort of steadfast on all 3 of those dimensions. Now, as I mentioned, there's also one bonus question here, and here the American and Israeli messaging has been sort of gone back and forth. of whether or not a goal of this war is regime change or not. I think right now the consensus is regime change in Iran, moving to a somewhat more moderate regime or somewhat favorably disposed regime. That would be certainly a plus, but it's not, as of the present moment, an expressed interest of the war. Now, what does victory look like on the Iran side? Well, that looks somewhat different. On the one hand, the sheer survival is a sign of victory, right? So they want the regime to continue on. Preferably with Iran maintaining its at least some semblance of its nuclear program, its missile program, and its proxy network as well. To a lesser extent, Iran has also shown, though, that he would want something more than that. He would want to roll back American influence in the region, which is why Iran has sort of predicated ceasing missile attacks on the Gulf states on taking United States forces out. So, in some ways, Iranian ambitions of what a victory looks like for Iran, would be potentially much broader, sort of more of its hegemonic ambitions that we've seen sort of play out in Iranian statements in the past as well.
And if we look at what is happening on the ground, and considering what you just mentioned, that can be ticked as a victory or as an achievement acceptable by both the US and Israel, how close are they of achieving this?
Well, let's start with the United States and Israel. So on the nuclear program, we don't really know. There hasn't been public announcements of how much of the enriched uranium stockpiles that the Iranians do have been destroyed in the conflict, at least out in public just yet. There have been statements by the Iranian government that it's buried underneath a lot of rubble. I take those statements with a grain of salt. On the missile front, it's notable that Iranian missile attacks have slowed, although they continue on, at least relative to where they were at the initial outset of the conflict. The rate of fire has died down somewhat. And it's also fewer missiles now than back in total volume for volume than back in the 12-day war here. Now it's a broader range of strikes as well. So there is some sign of Iranian missile capacity being diminished as well. How lasting that is, I think we'll need to wait for the dust to settle. Now, as for the proxy question here, again, we've seen successful rollbacks, particularly of Hezbollah in Lebanon here, is where I think most of the fighting is. There's been some movement with Hezbollah in Iraq as well. It's going to be really hard for the United States and Israel to force Iran to stop funding its proxy networks simply from the air as well. It's just, if you think about what air power can and cannot accomplish, that tends to be a fairly high bar. Now, let's look on the, on the bonus question here, the regime change one. Obviously, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, is now replaced by his son. So figure that as sort of a net wash for the time being. There's open questions of, how much the younger one is still, well, the indications are that he's alive, but he may be hurt. But the regime itself still is very much intact. Now, for the Iranian side, thus far, Iran has succeeded in, surviving, unlike, I think, what some had originally hoped. The regime did not collapse under the initial barrage of American and Israeli firepower, and it's settling in for a longer haul. It's been significantly weakened, though, and I think it's also going to be weakened on the longer term diplomatically as well. It's hard to imagine the Qataris, the Omanis, all the people who were somewhat favorably disposed to Iran being particularly favorably disposed to them now going forward after they've been pummeled by Iranian missiles and drones.
And if we focus now more on the proxies, if we look at what's happening in Lebanon, do you see that for Israel keeping Hezbollah presence is something that can happen, or this time some analysts compare it to 1982, with the PLO and chasing them out. Are we in the same situation, and can they really achieve it? Because from what we see in the region, and you seem to, say it in a different way, the original plan isn't going as planned.
Yeah. So I mean, look, the 1982 example I think is apt in a couple different ways. In that it spurred an invasion of southern Lebanon. It also didn't go so well from the Israeli perspective. Like, it ended up being a protracted commitment, and both the PLO but also Hezbollah are still alive and, well, kicking today. I think it's true that Israeli ambitions, particularly vis-a-vis Hezbollah, have grown. It's hard to, I think, fully uproot Hezbollah from particularly the Lebanese Shiite population of southern Lebanon. It's baked in there. What I think Israel can reasonably expect to achieve is to degrade its military capacity, potentially have a long-term deterrence effect so you retain some sort of safety and stability for northern Israel, allow, particularly that farms along the finger of the Galilee and, that region of Israel to get back to semi-normality. The idea that I think you can strictly destroy Hezbollah by military force alone, I think is going to be a tall order. I think the optimistic scenario would be that if you particularly have put enough pressure on Iran to curb its support to Hezbollah, and you put enough military pressure on Hezbollah directly, that you can then work out some sort of diplomatic settlement. Whether or not that actually happens, I think, remains to be an open question. But that's ultimately what will need to be pointed to at the end of the day.
And so do you think that the Lebanese government, that for the first time declared, Hezbollah's action as illegal, and, they put forward a plan to disarm Hezbollah, do you see this plan happening?
Look, I think it's an incredibly positive development in the region, right? The fact that you have the Lebanese government now committed to trying to disarming Hezbollah is a big diplomatic change, and that bodes well for a region that, frankly, has been fraught with conflict for decades now. Now, the question whether or not the Lebanese government actually has the capacity to force Hezbollah to disarm, and that, I think, remains to be seen. Now, the Lebanese government traditionally has been much weaker than Hezbollah. The Lebanese armed forces are weaker than Hezbollah. I mean, during one of my last field walk in the region, I was talking to an analyst, is like, if you want to see who has the true power in Lebanon, compare the average salary of a Lebanese armed forces soldier to the average salary of a Hezbollah operative. And there's orders of magnitude difference. It tells you how many resources are on one side or the other. Now, one could hope is that partially through military action, partially through diplomatic negotiation, that balance can even out, and the Lebanese armed forces can then police Hezbollah, and then you can return to stability on Israel's northern border. That would be good for Israel, but it would also be good for the people of southern Lebanon who've been caught in the crossfire for far too long.
And as you mentioned, it's very unlikely for the regime in Iran to continue to stop supporting Hezbollah. If we look at the outcome of this war, whereby the scenario that you mentioned, well, the US and Israel consider that they degraded the military infrastructure enough in Iran, and that's a good enough achievement that the regime stays in place. It is weakened, but it's still there. In your opinion, what comes after that?
Assuming the regime is still in place, I think the Iranian regime will continue to rebuild, just slowly. It's going to be predicated on how much damage is done. And there's a couple of reasons for that. If the Iranian regime remains in place, I think it will at least tell itself that this was a victory of sorts. It stood up to the United States and Israeli power and still continued to survive. And then in addition to that, from just a strategic calculus, the question is what other options do they have but to double down on this proxy network and its missiles in particular? I mean, what other sort of tools can it rest its deterrent capability on? And the third, I would say that the Iranian regime, because it is wounded and because it's been bloodied, may be bent on revenge too, which also means that doubling down on the proxy network too, which makes it very, very dangerous. If it's, assuming it continues to exist, even if in weakened form.
Do you think that we could see a scenario similar to what happened in Yugoslavia in the 90s happen with Iran, whereby the central government loses control and you have, from different regions, from different ethnicities, uprisings, and that they're unable to keep control of the country?
I mean, it's possible. The places you talk about that are really with the Kurdish regions, particularly along the Iraqi-Turkish border. If that was to happen, that will cause possibly dangerous second-order effects, because any uprising in Kurdish nationalism is going to trigger a Turkish response that creates its own challenges. The other place that you talk about that is with the Baluch toward the Afghan border. That has its own challenges with it. In general, look, I think you would hope that the Iranian regime, that Iran remains intact as a country, just under different management. The challenge with that is that thanks to the uprising that happened, that the Iranians crushed forcefully, they, by some estimates, killed upwards of 30,000 dissidents, the people who will be the first ones to take the natural step to protest the regime. That's going to have a harder time sort of changing the Iranian government as a result, probably because the natural leaders have all been killed. So, it's possible that you can get Iran to fracture, but you should be careful what you wish for, because that can look very ugly depending on how it fractures and who controls the different parts of Iran in the aftermath.
Today, from what you see, from what you read, from the information you gather, what is the most likely scenario in your opinion?
I think my most likely scenario for the future of Iran was that Iran emerges from this severely weakened but still intact as a country. That the regime remains in control, and that it remains sort of vengeful and doubles down on its malicious behavior in the aftermath afterwards. Its capacity to actually inflict harm on its neighbors may be diminished, but I don't think it goes away entirely, and I think left to its own devices will rebuild. I'm always an optimist, so I wish it would turned out differently. And
but I mean, I want to
discover peace, love, and apple pie.
Of course, but I want to continue in that scenario. Just let's say what happens the day after. Let's put on the cap of any Gulf countries.
Sure.
They didn't participate in the attacks, yet Iran ended up attacking them. There is, if you look at the positioning today, a defensive positioning with Iran, but not offensive. They're not participating. So if Iran emerges out of this war and can claim sort of the victory, what do you think is the proper strategy for these Gulf countries to adopt?
Yeah, so I think on the short term, what I would expect the Gulf countries to do is, first off, going on a massive weapons buying spree, particularly on air defenses. And then I would think about more regional integration across the Gulf states. particularly as it comes to air defenses and the like. What this war has highlighted is that despite, fairly vast, well before this conflict, the Middle East was already buying lots and lots of weapons. But even now going forward, despite that, they've shown that, these countries are still geographically very vulnerable. But expect there to be sort of deep integration between them. In terms of changes in foreign policy outlook, I think that's going to depend a little bit on which country we're talking about. I think the UAE will have a different calculus than Qatar does, for instance. But, I think there's a question here, which is, do they view American security guarantees as being core to their security, or do they look for elsewhere? Problem is, if they look elsewhere, I don't think they have another real option for the moment. The Chinese, I don't think, are particularly interested in giving those security guarantees. The Russians don't have the capacity, and they don't have the ability to build it themselves. So I think for better or for worse, they're stuck with us. But if I was advising a Gulf country, what I would do is look to regional integration there as well. And, particularly as it comes to air defenses and the like, I think there's also a question here of whether or not, I think there should also be a internal assessment of whether this defensive crouch is the correct one, hoping that, I think what the Gulf is betting on is that if you do this defensive crouch, Iran will limit the number of attacks it does on these countries, and rather if we went full-fledged offensive, that it would be that much worse. I think there'll be a period of self-reflection after this war is over, whether or not that's the right bet, or whether or not staying on the defense actually was a net strategic loser for these countries.
Dr. Cohen, thank you. You've been very insightful. I just want to conclude on a final question is, continuing on this scenario, in your opinion, how long before the regime in Iran can rebuild, as you mentioned, its capacity? And is it potentially the reason for another war in the future?
How long it takes Iran to rebuild will depend directly on how much damage is done during the conflict. So, those two are correlated. I don't know is the short answer, because we don't know the full extent of the damage. As for, what it will do going forward, I think that will, as I said, I think it's liable to strike back, and strike back usually indirectly via its proxy network. And if it does that, I think they're liable to trigger another war, if these remain in place. Absent them negotiating some sort of long-term settlement about particularly their nuclear weapons, but to a lesser extent their missiles and their proxies as well, this is going to continue to refuel global instability. And if they do, are hell-bent on revenge and try to enact on that, they're liable to get a backlash both from the Israelis, but also from us, the U.S., but also from the other Gulf states, and other Arab states as well, potentially, if they, depending on what kind of action they do. In some ways, they're going to be in their court.
Dr. Cohen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Khaled. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you for the last half hour.